Fear and Hunger is a brutal dark fantasy RPG set in the dungeons of Fear and Hunger, where multiple characters brave the darkness and madness that lurk within. The game is available on Steam. Atmosphere. The game's main theme is desperation. The depraved and darkened prisons and caves hide a terrifying feeling of malice. Everything is out to get you. You're constantly being pushed to deal with bad situations the game leads you into. Enemies are brutal and the combat is unforgiving. The game doesn't adhere to the sort of expected game logic you'd find in a lot of other RPGs, and instead presents you with the cold reality that standing on a rusty nail will eventually lead to you dying from an infection. Things are unrewarding, and the game is full of traps and doesn't provide much relief from the unending, oppressive feeling you get from exploring. There's an overwhelming sense of impending doom. Death lurks around every corner, and you never have what you need when you need it. The game's dark fantasy themes also provide a feeling of emptiness, spirituality, and loneliness beyond the limited view distance of its bleak environments. You hear of gods, but only see monsters. People say they want to help, but then betray you. Kindness is a commodity that the game can't spare. There's a fine line between life and death that has you constantly balancing your luck on a coin toss. Everything feels final, every benefit a cruel trick. It's all a joke at your expense, and the game always wins. Fear and Hunger feels like few other games do, that you're really out of luck. This place is depraved and you shouldn't have come here. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. Just a few of the game's scares come from traditional things, like the piano stab when an enemy sees you and begins to give chase, to entities moving around and lurking on the edge of your peripheral vision. Since everything can be a threat, anything that comes out of the darkness at you is inherently terrifying. Some of the fear comes from anything new, and lots of enemies have specific powers or the ability to do horrible things. The combat itself generates fear, with dealing with enemies being a real luck-based challenge. Each foe has their own specific way of being defeated, whilst you try and take as little damage as possible, which you won't know how to do the first time, and even if you do, combat can be over extremely quickly, since it's really just luck that keeps you from having your arms and legs torn off by the first monster you see in its opening move. But the remainder of the fear comes from the themes and concepts that the game provides, with its otherworldly harshness. Joining in on the rabbit cult may restore your health the first time you visit, but failing a coin toss, and it's game over as you lose your mind and stay having sex with them forever. Losing fights doesn't always just result in a game over, and can instead lead you to witness some horrifying death scenes as your skin is removed and you're beaten to a pulp, or worse. Meddling with anything feels inherently a bad idea, and there's a certain paranoia you can get from interacting with anything, a sense of unease that's only alleviated by how the game, on its default difficulty, has beds as fixed save points, allowing you the room to experiment as long as you aren't kidnapped or killed in your sleep. Attempting terrible and depraved things just to see if it'll give you an edge over the things that assail you can also result in a howling indifference to the game. So what? Did you expect something good from what you did? The true fear of Fear and Hunger is how uncaring it is that your plight means nothing. That's 2 Harry Masons. Sound design. The feeling of darkness and hopelessness is conveyed beautifully through the sparse, dissonant and disturbing music. The sound of flies, the pensive tapping of some hi-hats, and something that sounds like the scraping of a wardrobe being pulled across a wooden floor eventually gives way to a pulsing biological rumble of what sounds like the literal belly of the beast. Whilst the soundtrack is full of strange and unnerving sounds that come together to give off an unnatural feeling that you get while exploring the game's dungeons, some of the sound effects can be really good, but some don't match up too well with what's happening. Using a bone saw has a very strange, rather tame sawing effect that's followed up by a gut-wrenching, snapping bone effect that's difficult to stomach. But for the most part, things like the enemies howling, the eerie whimpers and whines, doors opening and closing, and other more generic sound effects suit their parts really well. There's no voice acting and not a lot of directional audio either, though the game didn't really need a lot of it. That's 3 Harry Masons. Gore. The gore in the game is represented both visually in its grim art style and in the horrifying conceptual things, with sexual violence as well as good old-fashioned brutality being both difficult to stomach visually and deeply unpleasant any way you think about it. Fear and Hunger spares you nothing. Decapitations and dismemberments are a big thing in the game. Enemies die faster without heads, but it can also be you sawing off your own infected foot instead of dying, as well as losing an arm in battle. Either will result in your character crawling on the floor, determined to brave the darkness. Blood rituals and blood-stained altars, corpses and ritual sacrifices are everywhere. Decapitated to gods you don't know. You can resort to cannibalism to survive. You can murder people in cold blood for no reason. There's also blood magic and other avenues of torment that neither playthrough ventured into, but it's not hard to believe that Fear and Hunger would dare go to them. That's 4 Harry Masons. Story. Fear and Hunger begins with you choosing your character and has an appropriately bleak and depressing backstory for each one. The 2 we tried had travelling to distant lands that changed them and being betrayed by the countries they worked for. The game has a ton of interesting story that can be difficult to uncover, with random books being the only place you can really read about some aspects of the story, that you again must flip a coin to determine if you'll even find, but the books can also take you to different lands and have you meeting with new gods, which was absolutely fascinating. A lot of the story feels like you're uncovering something forbidden and terrible, and you can even find and attempt to open the Necronomicon. So books often have a vague crossover with real-life things or things founded in other media. The lore is very deep and varied, and lots of it can seem irrelevant and still hold some weight to the events in parallel with the plot. It's hard to fully appreciate the story without spending even more time delving into old tomes and the limited chance you even have to read them, but the game's story is incredibly enticing to try and delve into. Making the final score 5 out of 5 Harry Masons. Big thanks to Ruby who captured the night playthrough, which helped a lot to bolster the footage. Fear and Hunger is a dark and bleak game that I was expecting to find an arduous chore to play, but whilst it's punishing, at least the default difficulty does allow some room for hope, no matter how bleak the game itself is. Again, I'd like to remind you the whole thing is down to my opinion of horror games. If you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst I ventured into the dungeons of Fear and Hunger, I didn't leave.